Welcome back to Radio Rothbard. I'm Ryan McMaken. I'm a senior editor with the Mises Institute, and with me here in studio is Tho Bishop, and we're actually physically in the same room because we are here at the Mises Institute for the Austrian Economics Research Conference. And so it's exciting. We've got all these scholars showing up today. And we're going to talk a little bit about the interdisciplinary approach that we have here at the Mises Institute and what sorts of scholars are here, because it's not all economics. And so how would you describe this event and the sorts of people that are here, Tho?
Well, I think it's great that you actually have a platform like this where you can have serious, deep discussions about theory that not only bring in professional scholars, but we'll have several medical doctors here presenting papers in a variety of different subjects. We have entrepreneurs. We've got people that have experiences outside of the kind of the sterile environment of higher education. And that's one of the reasons why I've always enjoyed AERC as one of the highlights of the Mises Institute year calendar. Because, again, there's not many opportunities where you have a conference where you get that sort of engagement, right? Not being a scholar myself, my understanding is they tend to be very disconnected from other disciplines, from other non-scholars, right? And I think one of the things that makes AERC special is that it's not limited only to PhD economists. And I think this itself highlights some of the advantages of the Austrian approach generally, the Mises Institute's approach to Austrian scholarship generally, and it's perhaps something that, with so much focus on Austrian economics itself as a term, we can kind of overlook some of the other ideas in terms of politics and history and some of the other fun stuff that we enjoy talking about with this show. And so this is just, I think, a great platform for deep dives into some of these other aspects of Misesian ideology.
Yeah, that's a good point about this being a mixture of different disciplines, because when I was in grad school, you were supposed to be prepared for the big event of the year, which was you'd go off to the American Political Science Association conference, and it was all just political science people. There was an occasional other interloper from some other discipline and something. Maybe a couple of people would co-author a piece. But it was clear what the real emphasis was. And so there was only one type of method that you would encounter and one field, essentially, with its subfields. But really, it was really quite limited. Certainly not multidisciplinary in the way that the conference here is. And so, yeah, you sometimes lose sight of that, of course. I've been around the Mises Institute long enough that I've just been kind of used to the interdisciplinary approach, but it's not that way everywhere. And what is an academic conference, just for those who have never had any reason to follow it or pay any attention, it's something where really people who write books, people who are faculty, people who write academic articles, they just get together and they show each other their research and they talk about it and they try to make it better. And so you're supposed to tear apart some other person's paper if you think it's poorly done or they haven't considered something important and so on. And you prefer that somebody does that to your paper before you actually try and get it published, because then it's better research. And they might give you ideas for a book chapter or something like that. So that's really the purpose of it. These are for people who do research professionally or a lot of the time, and they're just looking for ideas. And of course, other people who aren't professional researchers, they can participate, of course, because maybe they just know a lot about one particular subject and they can come and add into that. But yeah, AERC is different. But I think part of that is because the Mises Institute is hardwired to be multidisciplinary, because I've seen this a lot in social media and in comments that people leave about the Mises Institute. It's usually in the form of people will get annoyed if we take a position on foreign policy that they don't agree with. And this is related to that whole phenomenon that you saw for years where people would say, oh, I agree with Ron Paul, except on foreign policy, right? Boy, how many times did you hear somebody say that, right? And then what they say here is if you carry a foreign policy article, which of course tends to be in favor of peace and international cooperation and trade and so on, they'll say, hey, just stick to economics because you're just an economics institute, which is not at all true. If you go to the About page on Mises.org and you look at what we're about, there's really three main planks that are outlined there. It is the Austrian school in economics, And so, of course, we look at that, and that's listed first, but also is honest history, as the way we put it, which could also mean revisionist history. That is history that tries to really provide a balance, a counterbalance to the regime version of history.
De-bamboozle, I think, is the word that Rothbard always liked to use.
Okay, sure. Yeah, that makes sense. And then the other plank of it is international peace. And I think if you look at the history of classical liberalism, that is Cobden, Bastiat, Ron Paul, Jefferson, all of these people, Jean-Baptiste Say, the French liberals, the English free market people, they were all in favor of peace, and they opposed, say, the Crimean War, much to their discrediting in the eyes of people who were imperialists, right? So they took all sorts of abuse over their positions on foreign policy. And that's just what being laissez-faire and liberal in the true sense of the term is all about. And the Mises Institute's always understood that. Of course, this interdisciplinary approach goes back 40 years, since we're approaching our 40th anniversary. And so I think we're going to talk a little bit about these other issues and how they fit in, and how economics just in itself is not sufficient for a real good worldview in terms of what's necessary to help along human freedom.
And I think another thing that is not always fully appreciated about the Institute, because there's so much emphasis placed on the works of the great men that have come before us, right? Mises and Rothbard. And, there's some criticisms about, cults of personality and things like that. It should be really called the Rothbard Institute, right? And this is all sort of stuff that, has gone around for decades. But a big part of it is that I don't think people appreciate the diversity in terms of different sort of viewpoints on some of these other issues, right? Because like the Institute, our focus is promoting Misesian social science, right? And so there's the praxeology and its applications to economics and some of these other worldviews. And so within that sort of methodology, you're going to have occasionally disagreements. And some of those disagreements may come from different understandings of history and may come from different perspectives. For example, right now, obviously, we've got a lot of friends associated with the Institute that's in Eastern Europe. Their perspective of Russian invasion in Crimea and Ukraine is very different than we have as Americans, right? Our focus is kind of the American empire. Their focus is the threat of recognizing the consequences of Soviet invasions in the past, right? You're going to have disagreements within a general field, and that's okay. And the nice thing about having a platform like this is that we can have serious, honest, sincere, and good faith discussions about these things. And again, that is what is so rare, I think, increasingly so, kind of within the modern world right now, is genuine good faith disagreements on things that can be hot button. There's various views within the Misesian fold on immigration, for example, right? And so again, this is an opportunity where we can have those differences played out within sort of the gentleman field of academic papers and serious substantive conversations.
Yeah, immigration is a great example, right, where a lot of the people who don't follow the research and what we're publishing on it very closely assume there's the correct position, when the reality is that we have a diversity of views that we've carried on the site. And but when you look in social media, everyone is very, very sure they know exactly what it was that Rothbard would have said about XYZ, or Mises would have said, but that's not always quite accurate. It's often helpful to actually take a more serious look at what's been published about it and being respectful toward what other people think. And that's what the conference is all about. But also, I think when you recognize that you need all of these different fields, you also recognize the limits of your own knowledge, right? If you're an expert in money and banking, and goodness knows we need those people, you're not also going to be an expert on the Cold War and on theories of international relations. You're just, unless you're some sort of mega genius that is incredibly hard to find, and I'm not even sure such a person really exists in the modern world when there's so much information to deal with, you're just not going to be able to do that. So you're going to have to simply rely on other people who maybe have a different perspective and have some information and some thoughts on things you never considered before. But we know that the Austrian school is very important. And we're very much known for that, right? Austrian economics, praxeology, the work of Mises and Rothbard on that. But how do these other fields factor into that? And we've talked, just you and me, in the past about the need to cultivate maybe some more scholars, some more historians, some more political scientists who I think could really contribute more to this field. We've always had them, of course. We've had Rako. We got Hunt Tooley as a historian who's still with us. Chris Calton has done a bunch of material for Mises.org. And then, of course, Patrick Newman, who's trained as an economist, but has put a lot of effort into doing serious historical work as well. But that takes real effort to actually do that, to write as a historian. That's a different skill set you have to actually learn, regardless of what your formal training might have been. So there's that, and some of those things are very popular. And I think people, whether they know explicitly why it's important, they understand why it's very important to have a story for historical events and why those things happened and why your view of history is extremely important. And I think Hayek looked at this and noted that, sure, you can have lots of discussions with people about, well, reason and logic, and if you follow my logical progression through the 16 steps that I'm about to take you, I'm sure you will appreciate in the end that free markets are the way to go. And for some people, that works, because that's how some people learn, how some people choose their ideology. But I would venture to say, more cases, a more often thing that happens is people base their ideology based on the stories about history that they know.
I think you have to be on some sort of spectrum to fully appreciate all the logical steps that go into all sorts of deductive logic there. And of course, this is what I think made Rothbard such a powerful thinker himself, right? Not only was he a brilliant economist, within that specific discipline, but it's his historical work that I think, it coupled with his advances within libertarian political ideology, right? These are the things that kind of elevated him, that made his economic contributions even more popular than they otherwise would be, because, if you're interested in Rothbard's history or Rothbard's politics, you end up getting around to Rothbard's economics. And of course, back in the day, you read Guido Holzmann's biography of Ludwig von Mises, and you can appreciate that, the old, Austrian Vienna style of higher education, right? You weren't specializing in a closed off discipline of economics, right? Mises was studying law, and he was studying history, and he was studying these much larger questions of civilization. And I think you also see this reflected in, you think about De Soto's great work, his treatise on money and banking, right? There's a great legal component in there. He himself is a legal scholar in his own right. Right. And so he combines that knowledge with history, with economics, to present his defense of his view of Austrian banking and things like that. This is something that is throughout. I think that the greats of the Austrian tradition is the ability to engage seriously and substantively within different disciplines, and which is, again, why making sure that we, perhaps, you don't necessarily have to be a Huerto de Soto and be a lawyer and a PhD economist, but if we can simply generate new generations of Austrian-inspired scholars that might specialize in, history in its own right. It was interesting last year during our Rothbard graduate seminar, we had several PhD students who were focusing in history, one in indigenous history in particular. And so for them, having the exposure of human action and the way that, they recognized, wow, like this is economic laws that I can apply throughout different periods of human history. That's something that they didn't have exposure to prior to discovering the work of the Institute. And again, it's neat to have a conference like this that can be inviting to these sort of advances outside of just economics purely defined.
Mm-hmm. And the stories can have a huge effect just on your worldview, right? I discovered these historical events, and one thing led to another in this view of history, and that's why I think what I think now about human nature, about whether markets work. Because just imagine you're brought up your whole life believing that the Industrial Revolution made the world a worse place. Well, you're probably not going to end up a free market person because you think factories are satanic mills and you buy into that certain 19th century and 20th century line of thinking. Conversely, just think about how much people have battled over what is the proper way to view the Middle Ages, right? That's had huge implication in terms of people's religious views, in terms of their views of decentralization and the state, because if the Middle Ages was awful with a bunch of little states, then clearly the flowering of civilization in reality was the Renaissance, when we got big states and powerful princes, and that was the correct thing to do. So people look at that, and whether they even understand it, they've been fed this certain historical narrative, and then that feeds into what it is they believe about something.
And this is why Murray Rothbard played so much emphasis on kind of that Whig theory of history, that, you know, whatever came about afterwards was necessarily better than what came before. And this is, I think, something that's always kind of motivated sort of that historical revisionist aspect of, you know, Mises Institute content. And of course, the consequences to today, you see the political landscape. I know this is a topic that's come up a lot with the Liberty versus Power podcast I've done with Patrick. You know, there's a tremendous amount of like modern day conservatives that still view they've got this soft spot for economic nationalism, right, which really comes about because of Jean-Baptiste Colbert, right, who directly influenced Alexander Hamilton. And so there's this view that, oh, well, Hamiltonian economics is what made America great in the first place. So why wouldn't we embrace industrial policy and tariffs and all these like Hamiltonian ideas now if we want to make America great? And yet, if you look back and you recognize, like, well, Colbert's economics actually helped kind of sow the seeds for the French Revolution, right? Which is what conservatives are supposed to recognize as kind of the bad turning of human civilization. So just that key insight on whether, you know, was Colbert good or bad for French civilization, something as you know, abstract, you know, or you know, relatively obscure as that in modern conversation, has massive ramifications to major political doctrines playing out in the stage today. And so, you know, there's a whole lot of value when you can unravel the certain threads that go into just how the intricate tapestry of human society.
Well, and back to the Middle Ages thing, right? Among traditionalist conservatives, you still find people who are convinced the 13th century was like this golden age where hardly anybody ever did any work and everything was great and everyone was in the bosom of a loving family and community, and you just went to mass on Sunday and had a long party afterward and nobody had fights and everything was great. And you encounter this, and the reality of the 13th century wasn't as delightful maybe as people think. There were good things about it, but that's not normally what those people mention. The good things about the 13th century was actually the smallness and weakness of the states that existed. But you could spin narratives all day long, and if you don't actually know anything about the 13th century, then you're susceptible to what some other rando tells you about the 13th century. So these things are very important.
So you can't just deduct from an abstract statistical analysis and try
right.
to make
That's
these
exactly
numbers
right.
regress.
Praxeology will not tell me what happened in the 13th century. It just won't. And so this is why we need historians. And of course, Mises spent a lot of time on history. He wrote a theory in history and talked about his whole theory of how to analyze history called themology. And I don't want to get into a long discussion of that, but you could just break it down to why Mises was so concerned with history. And he said, look, yeah, universal laws exist of human behavior as well as the physical world, right? And he said, but we only have a limited knowledge of that. But what we think our knowledge of that is then guides our actual choices in life. And so, but looking at what choices did people make? What were the outcomes of those choices? In what historical contexts do these things exist? These are all things that a logical argument doesn't tell you. And Mises understood that. So he was always just really steeped, especially in the history of Austria-Hungary, which he knew like the back of his hand, and of his home region in what is now southern Poland. He knew a ton about like the relations between the nobles and the peasants and labor movements and gold and all of that stuff. And you read his stuff and he's using tons of examples in there. So he certainly understood the importance of history.
I think that was his first like published work was dealing with that sort of stuff. We are going to save our deep dive into thymology for Sweeps Week. Nothing brings in the clicks quite like a thymology discussion. But what I think is also interesting is the degree to which these sort of basic kind of fundamentals that seem very like almost self-evident, like when you talk to normal people, not kind of in the confines of academia, And that's what I think makes interesting some of the contributions that, we have, I think, 2 panels dedicated to entrepreneurship, which builds off of the theoretical advances that Peter Klein and Per Bylen and Nikolai Foss have made within these sort of subdisciplines of entrepreneurship and management and organizational structure and things like that. And so it's really neat how the just kind of core Austrian understandings of the world, when you have scholars that are willing to apply it in disciplines that aren't explicitly economic, can provide so much value where those scholars are rising to the top of these sort of subfields where there's such an institutional barrier for Austrians to advance within economics itself as a main discipline. That's another one of these aspects that I find interesting about a conference like this and about the work of Misesian scholars more broadly, is that it's identifying different pockets within the current existing academic structure where perhaps there are opportunities for scholars, well-versed in Mises and Rothbard to provide theoretical contributions in these other fields, which can then provide opportunities for them to survive and thrive in a university environment that would otherwise be hostile to us and our ideas within mainstream economics. And again, this just goes to the advantage of thinking broadly beyond, again, the narrow confines of catalytics, an pure exchange sort of market analysis.
Yeah. Well, how these fields can feed upon each other and affect each other, I think can be key, and in ways that you might not even anticipate. For example, right, people who are into Austrian econ often, if they're into Rothbard especially, like to talk about anarchy and anarchism and what does the anarchist society look like and how do different entities interact in an anarchist environment and so on. Well, there's already a field that studies how organizations interact in an anarchist environment. It's called the international relations field of political science, because for many international relations scholars, the given is that the international community is anarchic. And so what you have then is a group of organizations that exist in a world where there is no hierarchical power determining how these groups should behave. So in analyzing then how nation states interact with each other in an anarchic environment, we're actually learning a lot and devising real models and ways of thinking about how organizations might interact with each other in any sort of anarchic context. And if you can see the implications there if you start thinking about how do we assume these states interact. And you can think about how that could become very problematic depending on your view. So say you're a hardcore realist in the international relations field, which would mean that you think that states always seek to maximize their own power over others and that they have no interest in entering into organizations with others and that cooperation never works and that everyone is in a state of self-help in a state of anarchy. Now, that's a certain type of realist. That's like a certain type of offensive realism takes that position. But even then, what I'm saying is taking it a bit far. But you could see how a lot of people will simply settle on the notion that there is no real cooperation in an anarchic environment. Well, that has, if you get into that and you think that's the case, that has serious implications then for if you're dealing with a world, say, of covenant communities then, or any sort of market organization that might exist in an anarchic environment. And so you have to think then long and hard about how do states behave in an anarchic environment? How do non-government organizations interact in that environment? And then what does that tell us about market interactions? And so there's definitely some overlap there and implications for taking one position in one field and how it might affect then your thinking in a separate field. So I think it is important to know at least enough about those different fields that you might be able to gain insights from those.
And of course, and also the way that you perceive the economic strength of a foreign power would vastly change how you engage with them, militarily or in other perspectives as well. If you think the Soviet Union's economy is going to inevitably eclipse the U.S., then that might inspire you to act more hostilely than if you recognize that the consequences of socialism on a society erodes a lot of the sort of productive capacity that you need to challenge a global superpower. And we can see some more modern day examples with perhaps the economic well-being of China and some of these other powers. But again, if you're only focused purely on one specific lens, you're going to it can lead yourself to some very bad conclusions elsewhere down the line.
Right. And you can think about the trouble you would get into then by trying to come to broad conclusions about the behavior of states in the here and now if you don't know anything about the relative state of power between those different states, right? Well, obviously, the United States has nothing to fear from Laos, right? It's not a nuclear power. They have no economic power. There's no way they could possibly be an issue to the United States. But things are different if you're China, right? And as I've stated before, I'm not a China hawk. I don't think China presents like a real threat to the U.S. in terms of protecting itself and being unchallenged in the Western Hemisphere. However, it's not like China doesn't matter either. But how do you know how much it matters? Well, you have to answer certain empirical questions, right? Comparing its economy and how relevant is the size of its economy to its military power and these sorts of things. And again, economics doesn't really answer those questions for you, except in terms of understanding how perhaps free markets might enhance one's economic power, which of course I think is the truth. But looking at a lot of those related fields, then you need to investigate other places in one field if you're going to come to conclusions in another. And it's unfortunate, I think, that there's been so little emphasis on foreign policy or comparative politics and really understanding what's going on in other parts of the world. And that's been important, I think, in two fields, right? It's one thing to be the United States, which is geographically in an excellent location. And Americans benefit a lot from that. And the reality is that if you are the U.S. regime, you should have a much more laissez-faire view of foreign policy because you're surrounded by allies and oceans. And you really shouldn't be taxing the hell out of Americans then for foreign adventurism and various wars when you're not actually presented with any sort of serious threat to your position in the world or your safety. The U.S., as John Mearsheimer likes to note, the United States is the most secure country in the history of the world in terms of defense from foreign powers. That's just, that seems to me an empirical fact. But if you're a country in a bad location, a discussion of foreign policy for your country is going to be completely different. If you're Korea, you're sandwiched between some other much larger powers. If you're Poland, you're sandwiched between some other much more important powers. And we could probably point to half a dozen other countries that are in remarkably bad locations. Ukraine's in a bad location, right? And so that affects then the reality of foreign policy for that country. So it's necessary then, if you're going to come to some real conclusions about just the nature of international relations overall, you need to take into account more than just one or two countries that are in a certain type of place or in a certain type of context. So that requires real study and taking a lot of stuff into account.
And the nice thing is that, often there's a large international component to, an event like Austrian Economics Research Conference. And a lot of what we do just broadly as the Institute, we've got a lot of friends around the world. Obviously, we have a lot fewer of them with us here physically the last couple of years than we have in the past. Hopefully that might change come next year. But it is encouraging to see that we've got an entire panel for Mises Institute Brazil scholars, which is always interesting to get their perspective with some of the very interesting aspects of Brazilian society and some of the problems that they've been facing. So again, it is very happy to see that even though it's not as large as it has been, there is still a little bit of an international flavor here, which I think is so rewarding from getting some different perspectives.
Well, and I often think of those people too. And this brings me to the second issue of how just a focus on American history and American law and stuff is insufficient, is the issue of gun control also. Because a lot of Americans are just content with saying, what part of shall not be infringed do you not understand? The Second Amendment is there, so I see no reason to discuss even the issue of gun control. It's just the Second Amendment exists, so there can't be any gun control. Well, a foreigner you're not offering them anything. Say you have a foreigner who's interested in maybe gun control is bad, maybe there should be more private ownership of firearms. You have offered that person absolutely zero by saying Second Amendment's great. Because what are they going to go to say, well, we needed our own version of the Second Amendment, and they'll just say, well, that's an American thing that has nothing to do with us. It's not in our Constitution or our history. So you need to explain to people why the Second Amendment exists. And it turns out that there's lots of reasons for that extend beyond the United States, that extend back into history, right? These extend back into historical notions about defense from foreign powers, but provided through a decentralized mechanism, as well as providing means for opposing the executive power under your regime. But that's all English stuff from like the 16th century. Well, how does that translate into the here and now? You haven't explained any of that by saying the Second Amendment exists. But if you could explain to people that, look, this is how the Second Amendment works in terms of keeping order and defense from foreign powers. I mean, it seems that Ukraine might actually understand a little bit of the value now of maybe having autonomous militias where people are trained, where they can use firearms. I mean, the Swiss have always understood the value of this, right? A lot of countries, especially small countries next to much larger countries, would probably benefit a lot from a greater emphasis on having decentralized power and better training in terms of private ownership of arms and use and competence and that sort of thing. That's the root of the U.S. issue of private firearms. But none of that helps by just saying, well, it's in the Constitution. So it's important to look at that issue in terms of a larger historical and geographical scheme that isn't just about, well, Americans are good on that. So I think we need to really consider how would a foreigner look at this issue, and that extends to foreign policy, and I'm surely we could find other topics as well.
Now, there's definitely a lot we take advantage from being byproducts of kind of the Anglosphere sort of model. And of course, if we look at every other country from the Anglosphere, we can see just how easily some of those norms can go away, and very much have. And so, yeah, we should never take these things for granted. And some of the advantages that come from a cross-cultural engagement.
Yeah, and of course, being of part Mexican descent, I don't think all things Anglo-Saxon are all just the greatest stuff ever. But I do recognize that there's some pretty neat stuff that we get from that tradition. And even Mises said that, he made comments here and there about how, well, we're not an Anglo-Saxon country, so we don't have quite the strength of the respect for like parliamentary government and ensuring that we have power that's not too much centralized in the executive and that sort of thing. So he recognized there was even a nice tradition there, which perhaps maybe he was hoping to recreate in Central Europe. And of course, I'm thinking of the 1920s stuff he wrote in the 20s, right? But yeah, once you understand those differences, then maybe you can talk about them. But again, we're so far away from economics at this point, right? We're looking at the history of Parliament and how those institutions formed and the importance of institutions and their relevance to views of freedom and liberty and private ownership. And so that's just simply that it's not enough then to know the ins and outs of the gold standard. That won't explain these other things to you.
Yep. And that's why we're here, to learn more.
And so, yeah, I'm looking forward to what we've got. We've got some good things on the menu here. We don't have any IR themed breakout sessions this year, but maybe in the future, some scholars will send in some submissions for that. That would be, I think, a great session to have.
I do look forward to picking the mind of the great Yuri Maltsev and his opinions on some of the things going on right now. Looking at some of the keynote lectures we have, a lot of great scholars here, including Alex Pollock, who's going to have a very interesting talk on how the Fed made itself into the world's biggest savings and loan. But also Andrei Nemensky, who's a Russian scholar who's been to several AERCs, has a really fascinating book about communist co-option of Eastern religions. But he's giving a talk on Left Thought Collective, 100 Years of the Socialist Commonwealth, which I'm very much looking forward to. And of course, this is the 100th year anniversary of Mises's socialism, which will be getting a full catered spread and celebration in its own right, which I have no doubt will be a lot of fun to attend. Now, if you're listening to this, you will not get to enjoy, but just sleep well knowing that Ryan and I will be.
And will some of these talks be live streamed?
Our keynote talks will be live streamed at Mises.org/live. And I think there will be some additional content that is recorded and perhaps published afterwards.
Yeah, if you are a graduate student or a scholar and you want to participate, look it up. And maybe you can participate next year. It could be very fun.
And some of these papers will end up in the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics as well as other fine publications. And so, again, this is the way we continue to build the Misesian tradition and allow it to thrive.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us on this episode of Radio Rothbard. There's, of course, still plenty of sad things going on in the world, so I'm sure we'll have some topics related to that to discuss next week. But until then, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.